Preface, J.R. Campbell. Purpose of the book: not a comprehensive history of the May 1926 general strike. Avoids secret history or personality-driven theories to explain the strike. Focuses on the underlying causes, the strike structure, and its ultimate surrender on May 12. Scope of analysis: provides an analytical approach rather than a purely factual recounting. Avoids baseless theories and ensures all facts and figures are meaningfully integrated into the argument. Challenges simplistic explanations, such as attributing the strike to individual failures or circumstantial peculiarities. Critique of misleading theories: rejects the notion that exceptional circumstances, like Mr. Baldwin's weakness or cabinet extremists, caused the strike. Disputes claims within the labor movement that the General Council's surrender was due to personal failures or cunning individuals. Argues that these theories distract from the broader systemic issues. Key argument of the book: the general strike and its surrender stemmed from the broader societal and systemic decay. Labor leadership's inability to address new challenges and adapt to the era played a central role. Dealing with the General Council's actions: criticizes the General Council's inconsistent and misleading support for miners. February 27, 1926, initial pledge to support miners against wage reductions and uphold national agreements. Subsequent affirmations in March and April reiterated this support publicly. Contradictory actions secretly pressured miners to accept wage cuts. Revelations from Mr. Bromley: Bromley's report claims the General Council never fully pledged to back miners. This claim is refuted by evidence of repeated public pledges between February and April. Highlights the discrepancy between public declarations and private actions. Central thesis: the general strike was not about individual actions or short-term events but the systemic decay of the socio-economic order. The labor leadership's surrender reflected a failure of ideas, individuals, and organizational structures to address the era's challenges. Final implication: the book emphasizes that understanding the strike requires recognizing the broader context of societal and leadership failures, not just isolated incidents. Introduction. Overview of the 1926 general strike. The general strike was unprecedented in British labor history, marking a historic moment in the oldest capitalist country. The mass response of workers was immediate, united, and overwhelming. At midnight on May 3, 1926, transport and industrial operations ceased. Workers across industries halted their work without resistance, showcasing solidarity and determination. Sudden surrender. Despite the strong start, the strike abruptly ended, leaving workers confused and demoralized. Workers initially believed the government had conceded and organized victory celebrations. The government and mine owners announced the strike's failure as an unconditional surrender by the Trades Union Congress, TUC, General Council. Celebrations turned to bitterness and frustration within the workers' ranks. Need for historical context. The strike must be understood in the context of prior events. The years 1920, 1921, and 1925 laid critical groundwork for the strike. These years featured earlier threats of a general strike and pivotal moments in the labor movement. Preceding threats of general strikes: May 1920, a general strike was threatened to oppose British government intervention in Russia. Councils of action formed, challenging traditional parliamentary approaches to labor struggles. 1921, Black Friday, marked the failure of the Triple Alliance: miners, transport workers, and railwaymen. The miners were central to this crisis, but union leadership faltered, abandoning solidarity. The failure left a long-lasting mark on the labor movement, leading to a vow to avoid another Black Friday. July 1925, miners' issues resurfaced, leading to Red Friday, when unions showed resolve to support miners. Though no general strike occurred, the events pointed toward an eventual strike as a logical outcome. The government retreated under the pressure of the threat, temporarily boosting union leadership's credibility. The role of leadership across these events remained largely unchanged, dominated by those opposed to the general strike and its implications. Left-wing leaders were few and held limited influence over decisions. Despite leadership opposition, union congresses and conferences consistently made decisions that pointed towards a general strike. This contradiction highlights broader systemic pressures within the labor movement. Outcomes and reflections. For some, the surrender marked the end of the general strike policy. Political leaders capitalized on the strike's failure. Mr. MacDonald and colleagues sought parliamentary gains. Conservatives and liberals celebrated the resilience of parliamentary institutions. The deeper significance lies in the decisions taken by union bodies, despite leadership resistance, indicating a broader shift within the movement. Key questions raised: why did union congresses and conferences repeatedly make decisions favoring general strike policies, despite leadership opposition? What broader dynamics within the labor movement drove these contradictions? The events call for a deeper exploration of the structural and ideological forces shaping British labor during this period. Were the circumstances exceptional? The myth of exceptional circumstances. Critics argue that each general strike threat, 1920, 1921, 1925, 1926, arose from exceptional circumstances. 1920. Councils of Action formed to prevent war on Soviet Russia. Labor Party and trade unions united in direct mass action against the government. Result: war was averted, but the labor movement distanced itself from its own radical implications, labeling it an exceptional reaction influenced by the revolutionary wave sweeping Europe. Rebuttal of the argument: while the revolutionary wave influenced the British working class, the systemic economic and political tensions within Britain were also decisive. Similar crises recurred within months, driven by the structural problems of British capitalism. Recurring patterns in labor leadership and action. Critics and labor leaders consistently avoided examining the deeper forces driving repeated crises. Despite their commitment to gradual parliamentary progress, they were forced to make decisions contradicting their stated goals. 1925, June labor movement faced another decisive moment, illustrating the limits of parliamentary assurances. The futility of the exceptional explanation repeated crises, for major general strike situations in 6 years, undermined the idea of one-off, exceptional circumstances. Liverpool Conference of Labour Party, 1925 leadership ignored warnings about recurring crises, rejecting calls to prepare for future upheavals. The frequency of these events highlights fundamental systemic issues rather than isolated anomalies. Comparing this explanation to absurdities like blaming English weather on Bolshevik conspiracies underscores the inadequacy of the exceptional circumstances theory. A historical shift in British labor. The repeated involvement of conservative trade unions, led by cautious leaders, in general strike situations signals a fundamental shift. These events indicate a broader change in the trajectory of British history and working-class organization. This underlying shift challenges traditional leadership structures and reveals the emergence of new forces within the labor movement. Conclusion: new factors emerge with each crisis, but they do not account for the recurring structural failures and crises. The persistent recurrence of such crises within a short span reflects a fundamental change in the socio-economic and political framework of Britain. Understanding these events requires digging deeper into systemic shifts and rejecting superficial explanations of exceptional circumstances. Labor leadership and the change. Conservatism in British society and labor cultural ostrich policy. Many in Britain refuse to acknowledge fundamental changes in society, clinging to the belief that traditional methods will suffice. A deep-seated faith in the good old way dominates, leading to avoidance of addressing historical lessons or future challenges. Labor leadership's shortcomings, notorious for its lack of theoretical grounding and understanding of social evolution. Historically borrowed ideas and programs from capitalist frameworks, e.g., President Wilson's policies during World War I. Post-war labor leaders echoed capitalist calls for industrial peace and reconstruction, failing to develop an independent, worker-centered policy. Failure to address class interests. Labor leadership has consistently aligned itself with the ruling class, lacking decisiveness in supporting the working class. Their policies have been reactionary, influenced by external pressures rather than proactive understanding or planning. Post-war challenges and labor's inadequacies. Complacency and comfort. Labor leaders enjoyed privileged social conditions, excelling in union management but neglecting larger ideological and societal changes. Their complacency persisted even after World War I, ignoring the transformative post-war problems and social unrest. Disconnect from socialism and class struggle. Leaders viewed socialism as a distant goal, resisting engagement with the evolving class war. Their mindset was entrenched in 19th-century liberal and Tory trade union traditions, prioritizing a return to normalcy. Impact of post-war realities. Worker disillusionment. Workers, deeply affected by war and economic hardships, became disillusioned with the promises of capitalism. Revolutionary movements in Russia and Europe intensified awareness of capitalism's instability. Retreats and revolutionary echoes. Capitalist governments, including Britain's, retreated in response to mass movements, with labor leaders swept up in revolutionary rhetoric. Despite mimicking revolutionary language, labor leaders avoided substantial engagement, retreating to moderate liberalism. 1920 crisis and labor's role harnessing revolutionary momentum. In 1920, labor leaders capitalized on mass unrest to prevent war on Russia, averted through the councils of action. While they temporarily aligned with revolutionary energy, their approach was limited by a reluctance to embrace deeper class struggle. Missed opportunities. Labor leaders' inability to face historical shifts or adopt new strategies exposed deeper systemic weaknesses. Their actions reflected a broader failure to adapt to the demands of a changing era. Rise of the Communist Party ISE of the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, origins and distinction. Formed during wartime conditions, stemming from worker movements like the shop stewards and workers' committee movements. Marked the first political party in Britain explicitly focused on working-class interests, guided by daily political activity and international solidarity through the Communist International. Challenges and criticism. Faced opposition and ridicule from labor leadership, including accusations of receiving orders from Moscow. Even left-wing labor leaders, like Lansbury, joined in criticisms, albeit with localized objections such as orders from King Street. Learning and strengthening. Criticism strengthened the CPGB, helping it refine its strategies and understand its opposition. Unlike other parties, it analyzed European revolutions, sought lessons from them, and aligned its goals with international working-class solidarity. Contrasts with traditional labor leadership proactive approach. CPGB anticipated crises, developed policies to address them, and advocated for class-conscious action. Engaged with post-war challenges as signs of a new epoch requiring working-class leadership for progress, unlike labor leaders who sought a return to normalcy. Worker mobilization. Played a significant role in organizing unemployed workers, pushing for their integration into unions and broader labor movement alliances. Launched campaigns like Back to the Unions, compelling traditional union leadership to follow its lead. Institutional influence. Advocated for structural changes in union leadership, such as empowering the General Council of the Trades Union Congress, a move ultimately adopted during the lead-up to the 1926 crisis. Achievements and failures victories. Labor movement successes often mirrored CPGB's proposals and strategies. Advanced international trade union solidarity, including participation in the Red International of Labor Unions and pressure for international unity within British unions. Limitations. The CPGB lacked sufficient organic influence to replace traditional labor leadership during key crises like the General Strike of 1926. Mass discontent and resistance to capitalist failures drove the strike more than any direct leadership by the CPGB. The fear of communism capitalist accusations. The CPGB was frequently blamed by the capitalist class for economic and labor crises, a reflection of its growing influence and potential. Such fears stemmed more from the party's perceived future power than its immediate strength. Role in worker consciousness. The CPGB's growth coincided with rising worker class consciousness, driven more by the capitalist class's failures than by revolutionary propaganda alone. Class struggle dynamics. Failure of capitalism. Repeated betrayals and unfulfilled promises by the capitalist class fueled worker discontent and resistance. The inability of capitalism to ensure a decent standard of living intensified class consciousness and laid the groundwork for mass actions like the General Strike. Communist development. The CPGB's rise was a result of capitalism's systemic breakdown and the inability of traditional labor leadership to address workers' demands. The General Strike emerged not from communist manipulation but from widespread mass resistance to capitalist exploitation and neglect. Capitalist strategy and the strike. Two sides to the conflict. Workers and the ruling class. While analyzing the workers' motivations and developments, attention must also be paid to the ruling class's actions leading up to the General Strike. The ruling class avoided confronting General Strike threats directly on 3 occasions, 1920, 1921, 1925, before provoking the 1926 strike to smash it decisively. 1920. The ruling class's unstable position. Post-war discontent among demobilized soldiers and the general population made the ruling class cautious. Beautiful promises from wartime were unfulfilled, creating instability. The government avoided direct confrontations due to precarious political and economic conditions. 1921. Labor leaders' complicity. The government did not need to test its resolve in 1921 as labor leaders dismantled the threat themselves. A protracted capitalist offensive against wages followed, exposing the failure of British capitalism to recover from trade depression. The ruling class's long-term strategy. Post-war challenges created unprecedented pressure on the ruling class. Foreign political entanglements, unpayable debts, trade imbalances, declining basic industries, and rising colonial aspirations all signaled a crisis. Inspired by European revolutions, the ruling class unified its political apparatus to consolidate power. Tactical steps taken, destroyed the coalition government and created a powerful conservative majority. Orchestrated the rise and fall of the minority Labour government, 1924, forcing it into a continuity policy aligned with capitalist interests. Swept the Liberal Party aside, securing a dominant Tory rule. 1925, a strategic retreat. Growing worker solidarity and fear of industrial stoppages led to the government's retreat in July 1925, Red Friday. The subsidy settlement bought time for the government to strengthen its position, established the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies, OMS, to handle general strike logistics, bolstered police forces and integrated fascist groups into state mechanisms, targeted the Communist Party and the minority movement, recognizing them as serious threats. 1926, full-scale preparation for class war. The ruling class viewed the general strike as a full dress rehearsal for civil war, unified the middle classes behind the government, countering working-class solidarity, exploited the Labour Party and union leadership's lack of preparation to neutralize opposition. Labour leaders characterized the strike as a mere trade dispute, weakening its impact. Outcome of the general strike: the ruling class emerged victorious, having decisively beaten Labour leadership in both Parliament and the unions. However, the broader issues of British capitalism remained unresolved. Continued trade decline and worsening economic figures underscored systemic failures. April 1926 trade returns were the worst in 4 years, highlighting capitalism's ongoing decline. Refuting claims of exceptional circumstances, the general strike cannot be attributed to isolated, exceptional circumstances or conspiracies. It was the result of a long, unfolding process rooted in systemic contradictions. Declaring the death of the general strike ignores these unresolved tensions and the likelihood of future class struggles. Next steps in analysis: the writer proposes to outline the events leading to the general strike, provide a detailed account of the strike and its immediate aftermath, explore future perspectives and the tasks that lie ahead for the working class movement.